Okay, folks, I think we're going to get started here. For those, sorry I don't have a name tag, but for those that don't know me, my name is Dan Burnell. I'm the Operations Director with the Montana Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your interest in manufacturing. The goal of this panel today is to really talk about the state of manufacturing in Montana, where we're at, where we're going, and where are some key industries that are kind of emerging within the state. Presenting today, to my far right here, is Patty Fleming, who's with the Montana Manufacturing Extension Center, Paul Polson with the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and the final person who will be joining us shortly is Rich White, who works with the Boeing Company. Each will do a presentation about a particular project that they're working on and how they're growing Montana's manufacturing economy. So if, Patty, would you like to lead off? And I'll get the presentation up.
I'm with the Montana Manufacturing Extension Center. The National Institute of Standards and Technology funds a manufacturing extension partnership in every single state. MMEC is the manufacturing extension partnership for the state of Montana. So I want to talk to you today about the state of manufacturing as MMEC sees it, and also a project we're working on called What Would It Look Like If Montana Were a State of Manufacturing Excellence? So what's our current state? Well, there's a lot of ways to measure what our current state of manufacturing is and how well we're doing. One way is the percentage of our gross state product that is manufacturing. So we got a lot of industries in Montana, so ag obviously is a big one, tourism is a big one, retail. So where do we rank there? Well, in 2015 is the latest rankings I have. And so Montana's number 32. We have 27.56% of our gross state product is manufacturing. Is that good? I put some of our neighboring states on there. Indiana's number one at 74%. It's not for me to decide, but I would think that a lot of the economists have an opinion on what the percentages should be. I would think 25 would be a good ranking, number 25. You can see Wyoming's pretty far down. Oregon's number 2. And how have we been doing? Well, in 1997, we were number 41, and we moved up to number 32. So that's good news. But like I said, where should we be? Maybe you're in the middle of the pack. So some statistics on Montana manufacturing as it stands today. Manufacturing does provide great jobs. There's 23,400 jobs in the state of Montana that for manufacturing, and they earn 17% higher wages than the state average wages. My colleague Paul Polson has determined that every manufacturing job also creates 2.58 additional jobs into the Montana economy. So that's another 60,000 jobs in Montana that are a result of manufacturing. So total, we're at about 83,000 jobs in the state of Montana. Average pay in 2015 was $47,000 for a manufacturing job. But Montana manufacturing pay is actually only 72% of the national average. So that's something we should work on. We can also say that Montana's manufacturers are diverse, small, young, rural, and entrepreneurial. Some statistics that back that up is right now there's 2,841 manufacturers in the state of Montana. 81% of them have less than 10 employees. 68% of them are in our rural counties. 55% of them have been in business for less than 20 years. And 16% of them have been in business for less than 5 years. 4 years in a row, Montana has been ranked the most entrepreneurial state in the nation. We also know that Montana's entrepreneur manufacturers are providing jobs as the number of large manufacturers in the state of Montana decrease. A lot of us can remember a lot of the sawmills, aluminum foundry, copper foundries. Those are gone now, but they're being replaced with small entrepreneurial manufacturers. 20 years ago, we had about the same amount of manufacturing employees, 22,000, but we had half of the manufacturing entities. If you want to know where Montana's manufacturing is located. This map shows the number of manufacturers in each county. Gallatin County has just become number 1, surpassing Yellowstone with 422 manufacturers. 75% of all the manufacturing in Montana is in 9 counties. We actually even have 3 counties that have 0 manufacturing. Webo, Petroleum, and Treasure have 0 manufacturing. Not even somebody making knives out of their garage. Some of the trends that we see from the MMEC standpoint is Montana manufacturers are behind in terms of Industry 4.0, which automation. All Montana manufacturers seem desperate for employees, and they are starting to embrace automation. Alcohol manufacturing is growing rapidly in Montana. For the ag folks, they like to call that value-added ag, not manufacturing. So, food manufacturing is growing rapidly in the state right now. Fabricated metals is growing. Photonics is growing. There's over 30 companies in Bozeman area right now classified as doing photonics. Firearms is growing in Kalispell area. Outdoor and sewn products in Bozeman area is growing. But lumber is down, but engineered lumber is up. Another trend we're seeing is a lot of baby boomers are transitioning in the state of Montana, which equals a risk to jobs, especially in small towns. Manufacturer goes out of business there because the baby boomer can't find a buyer. Those jobs are all at risk. And we see large corporations are buying Montana businesses, manufacturers. I'll take a wild guess here, but I would say that Boeing probably didn't have a meeting where somebody said, you know, we really need to have a presence in the state of Montana. Instead, there was an opportunity for them. Number of manufacturers in Montana has grown by 40% in the last 20 years. Another interesting statistic is that since 2004, U.S. manufacturing employment has gone down 13%. Meanwhile, in Montana, it's gone up 5%. So that's about an 18% difference in the state of Montana. So we're doing good in those terms. So we're also facing a major challenge in the U.S. For the first time since 1870, we're looking at a possibility that our children will not have as prosperous of a lifestyle as we did. Started in 1870, that was Industry 1.0, steam engine. We go all the way up through 3.0, and we're at a point right now that if we don't do something, we don't have another major industry revolution, our children aren't going to have as good lives as we do. So that's where Industry 4.0 comes in. And also we're facing, the world has changed today. Maybe our grandparents lived in a world where there was one person that made decisions and we all fell in line. And today that's much more of a shared management style. And with the social networks, we have very vast networks these days. So it's really become a network-driven thing rather than a hierarchy. So at MMEC, we've asked, thanks to our good friend Alistair Stewart at MMEC, he brought this to us. What would it look like if Montana were a state of manufacturing excellence? And we also got our Rocky Mountain Bank to invest in this program. So how would we measure if we're a state of manufacturing excellence? Well, we could go on percentage of manufacturing GDP, or gross state product. Could we measure it based on employers, number of manufacturers? Could we measure the average manufacturing wage? There's a lot of different ways we could do that. So that's one of the things that we're discussing in our strategic doing. And how do we get there? Those are the two big questions we have. How do we get there? Is it through collaboration? Is it through more events? And what would be some of the milestones along the way? So thanks to Alistair Stewart, we've implemented a program called Strategic Doing. So this is my definition of what strategic doing is. It's a formalized and a proven method to get a group of people, that don't answer to each other, kind of like the network diagram I just showed, to accomplish something. How does MMEC use this to make Montana a state of manufacturing excellence? Well, what we've done so far with the assistance of Rocky Mountain Bank is to start collaborative groups in several different locations in Montana. There's currently the Gallatin Valley Manufacturing Partnership. One just got started here in Missoula. We've done one for the Montana photonics industry in Bozeman. We've done one in Yellowstone County for the manufacturers there. And the way it works is we basically get people to come to an 8-hour session where there's a training and a simulation. After that, you're broken into groups of 5, approximately. And as a group member of the 5, you have to agree to meet once a month. You have to agree to put in at least, or around 1 hour a month towards the project. And the group of 5 will determine a project, and the project needs to be done in 30 to 60 days, approximately. And then when you're done with that project, you pick another one. So that's kind of how strategic doing works. So here's another way of thinking of it. Strategic doing helps us do 2 things. Decide where we're going and how we're going to get there. But the one difference between strategic doing and typical old strategic planning, how many have ever sat through a 4-day strategic planning trying to figure out what your vision statement is and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So in those cases, we spent a lot of time, 4 days, figuring all this out, and maybe sometimes it even takes years before you actually begin to do some action. You cross the line into the do area and actually begin it. Another problem with that is oftentimes we end up with, by the time we get to doing, the data's changed. So the new strategy with strategic doing is let's not spend a whole lot of time thinking about things. Let's do little things, think about it, do another little thing, think about it, and gradually work up move the needle for manufacturing. So what can you do to assist in this effort to grow manufacturing in Montana and make Montana the state of manufacturing excellence? Well, collaborate with everyone. There is so much to be gained by just talking to your cohorts in manufacturing. Help out your fellow manufacturers. Ask for help when you need it. Participate in events like this. Also participate in strategic doing if you're asked. Network with everybody. Open your doors for tours. Those are fantastic ways to learn things. And get involved with the Montana Manufacturing Association. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Patty. We're going to have a Q&A after the next 2 presentations. So next up is Paul Paulson with BBER.
Thank you very much. I remember this room very, very well. It was a noon service club, and I was the speaker after lunch. And the person got up and said, "My job is not to give a long and boring talk about the economy. My job today is to introduce the person who will. Here is Paul Paulson." So that's how this room is embedded in my mind. You know, manufacturing probably has a very bad image. When you hear the term manufacturing, chances are you're going to see that as one of the modifiers. And it's not just some anonymous person making these sounds. I'm also guilty of it. This is something I wrote a couple of years ago, and that was my picture of manufacturing. If there's one thing you should take away from this room, is what Patty says and what I'm about to say, is that the way you identify manufacturing, the way you picture manufacturing, is not a big factory and not with a smokestack. Montana manufacturing is something very, very different. But we do have this bad reputation that manufacturing has across the country. Let's kind of look at the data and see how that reputation evolved and what's right about it and what's wrong about it. Here we have U.S. manufacturing employment. Starting in 2001, going out here to the recession in 2009, 2010, and a slight upward trend since the recession in 2009. Now, manufacturing employment overall from 2001 to 2016 has declined, and it was declining for a long time before that. Another way of looking at that is the red line. That's manufacturing employment as a percent of total employment. In other words, what's the share, or what proportion of jobs in the U.S. is in manufacturing? And you see that that too has been declining. So maybe one of the reasons why manufacturing had this wrong image is that we're looking at jobs, we're looking at employment. Well, there are other ways of looking at manufacturing. Instead of looking at jobs, remember jobs are an input, let's look at output. What is manufacturing producing? What is the value of manufacturing production? Here we have real GDP in manufacturing in the U.S. Notice that it does not have a downward trend. You can see the recession here, but overall, the value of manufactured products in the U.S. has remained relatively constant and, in fact, has grown a little bit since the recession. Another way of looking at that is the red line. This is the value of manufacturing production as a percent of total GDP in the U.S. And you can see that line is relatively stable. So manufacturing production is growing at about the same rate as the rest of the economy. So these are the things to keep in mind. It makes a difference how you measure something. If you look at manufacturing employment, you see a smaller industry. If you look at output, you see it's stable or even increasing. But there's a conflict there. How can we have growing output with less workers? Well, the simple answer is productivity. Manufacturing productivity has increased dramatically. It's been increased for a long time, and it continues to do that. This is just simply taking manufacturing GDP and dividing it by total employment in manufacturing. And you see that between 2000 and 2016, it has increased by almost 50%. So the output per worker is increasing dramatically. That's why you can have declining employment, but increasing output and production. It's how you measure and what you're using to measure that makes all the difference. Now let's look a little more carefully at U.S. manufacturing compared to Montana manufacturing. And now we're looking at employment. So remember, we're looking at input, not necessarily output. Here we have manufacturing employment since the last recession. It has increased about 4.9% from about 12.5 million workers to about 13 million workers. What about Montana? Like Patty said, since the last recession, Montana manufacturing employment has increased from about 21,000 to almost 24,000, or a 12.6% increase. But it gets even better. We have one major sector in manufacturing, the wood and paper products industry, that has really been in tough times. It actually declined. It declined by almost 26% since the recession. So if we subtract out the wood and paper products industry, we actually get an increase in manufacturing employment in Montana of over 20%, almost 23%. So the takeaway here is that since the last recession, manufacturing employment nationwide has increased. It's also increased here in Montana and at a much faster rate. So Montana manufacturing employment is growing faster than the U.S. In some statistics, where does Montana manufacturing fit into the Montana economy? It accounts for about 16% of Montana's economic base. And you can see the other components of Montana's economic base up there: federal government, mining, manufacturing, ag, non-resident travel, and transportation. Like Patty said, Montana manufacturing is concentrated in the smaller size classes. The average employment per firm, manufacturing firm in Montana, is 18 employees. But look here, almost half of the firms with employment have 1 to 4 employees. So manufacturing really in Montana really is a small business. Earnings per worker. This is 2016, you had 2015. Manufacturing jobs average about $52,000 per year. All workers in Montana about $44,000 per year. These are the various components of manufacturing. There are 22 industries within manufacturing, and that's just a whole list. It's a wide variety of lists. But how does the Montana manufacturing sector differ from the U.S. manufacturing sector? The largest industry in the U.S. in terms of employment was food products. The largest industry in Montana was wood products. Even though it's been declining, it still has more employees. Second place was food products in Montana. Second place in the U.S. was fabricated metal products. Third place is fabricated metal products in Montana. Machinery manufacturing in the U.S. And finally, that fills out the top 4 industries within Montana, or the top 4 manufacturing industries in the U.S. and Montana. Those are very general categories. Fabricated metal, machinery and equipment. Let's look specifically at some very fast-growing sectors in Montana manufacturing. First of all, let's start off with the alcoholic beverage industry. Here is breweries. And I presented 2 sets of data here, employment in breweries and also number of firms. Because there's really 2 ways in which an industry can grow. It can grow because you have more firms open up, or you can have increased employment at existing firms. So you see here in breweries, both were occurring. You had a 216% increase in the number of workers and 167% increase in the number of firms. So both sources of growth were occurring here. Wineries. Again, we had a 130% increase in employment, a slightly slower increase in number of firms. And finally, distilleries. So this puts some very specific nature on a very fast-growing sector of Montana's economy. Let's look at another sector. Small arms and ordnance. These are basically hunting rifles and things along that line. Most of these firms are down in Ravalli County, up in Flathead County. Most of them are out here in the western part of the state. Notice that we had a 200% increase in employment, but only a 40% increase in number of firms. So what's happening here is that existing firms are adding workers, not so much that new firms are opening up. And finally, we have electronic instrument manufacturing. This is one of the high-tech manufacturing industries. Much of this is concentrated down in Bozeman. And again, you can see that the growth in this industry was primarily increased employment at existing firms rather than new firms opening up. Third sector of Montana, exports. And here we're running into kind of a quandary, kind of an interesting thing. Here are the value of Montana manufacturing exports starting in 2002 and going out to 2017. We had a dramatic increase in Montana manufacturing exports until the recession. Since the recession, you see this has been relatively stable. What's going on here? I don't have the complete answer, but we do have to keep in mind that the trend in manufacturing exports is not necessarily totally caused by local people, by what's going on in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has had relatively slow economic growth up until very recently. It's called synchronized worldwide, or there now appears to be a recovery, but they're calling it is a synchronized worldwide recovery. We'll have to wait and see whether that shows up in Montana manufacturing. But I think that's probably the major reason for the stability in manufacturing exports. And you can see roughly the same trend in exports as a percent of all shipments. Dramatic growth up until the recession, decline during the first part of the recession, and the kind of a recovery here. We have to wait for the rest of the world and see what happens to this. Now, what's the outlook? What do manufacturers say is going to happen? Now, whenever we at the Bureau go out and talk now, this is a standard graph everybody has to take with them. We are now in the 9th year of a recovery. We are in the longest recovery since World War II. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that solid line is the probability of a recession. That's computed by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. The shaded areas are the actual recession. Recessions are a surprise event. Anybody who thinks they can predict them is probably going to be wrong. Notice how low the probability of a recession is right before that recession. Notice how low the probability of a recession was right before the 2000 recession. So recessions are a surprise event, and we haven't had one in a long time, so be thinking about that. We just completed a survey of Montana manufacturers and asked them several questions. The first thing we asked them, we just completed this survey this winter. What happened to your employment during 2017, last year? 50% of Montana manufacturers said their employment stayed constant. 42% said they expect an increase this year in 2018. Now, if we compare that to what they said a year ago, you can see they were slightly more optimistic now, because they said last year that they expected 2017 to be, they expect to have an increase. It looks a little different when we go from employment to outlook. What was your overall outlook during 2017? 30% said it was unchanged. 65% said they're expecting an increase in 2018. And this compares to 55% who answered that question last year. Now, what about the components? Here we have 4 major components of manufacturing: wood products, chemicals, food and beverages, machinery, and equipment. Notice that wood products are slightly more pessimistic this year than they were at this time last year, but all of the other sectors are more optimistic this year than they were last year. So with the exception of wood products, manufacturers are now more optimistic than they were at this time last year. So with that, I'll end, and we can talk about the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, and with that, hitting third is Rich White with Boeing Company. I'll get your presentation.
Thanks, Dan. So I'm the fill-in, and so what I'd like to do is I've got a short little presentation that I'll share with you, and then really leave everything to questions at the end. And what I really want to be able to talk about is, real briefly, the sort of state of aviation or aerospace manufacturing in the state of Montana. Obviously, for those of you who don't know, we bought a company in 2010 in Helena, Montana. Turned it into Boeing Helena, and we do hard metal machining work there. So hard metal is a titanium, aluminum is a soft metal. Actually, the very first side body cord, which is a piece of structure that connects the wing to the fuselage. So a slightly important piece actually was made in Helena, Montana for the 777X. And that first airplane is actually being constructed in the Everett factory right now, the first static test airplane. And obviously, aerospace manufacturing across the state of Montana, I think, has a lot of upgrowth and a lot of potential. A lot of folks here are suppliers of ours and whatnot. So, yeah, right, that one, right there, that's great. So what I'd like to be able to do is just maybe talk a little bit about the sort of global environment for airplanes. And this is a 737. So we are the largest exporter by value in the United States. 75 to almost 80% of every single airplane that we deliver to a customer goes to a customer outside the United States. So things like Export-Import Bank are super important to us. Open skies agreements, trade agreements with different foreign countries are really important because they support about 150,000 just Boeing jobs in the United States and overall about 1 million jobs in the United States. So obviously trade's a big important issue for us. Obviously we exist in a very competitive environment where our customers are always constantly asking us for more, for less. And every year we do an update to a thing called a current market outlook. You can actually go on to Boeing.com and search for current market outlook and it'll pop up. So it's a rolling 20-year forecast. We've been doing it since the 1950s. We've released it to the public since 1961. We've gone back and analyzed sort of the top level figures, and we're about 3% plus or minus accurate in terms of what the overall sort of global aviation aerospace market is going to be. And there's lots of things that go into our current market outlook that we analyze as both in an understrain as well as a constrained. And so it's overall, it's a very dynamic market where we've got so many jets in service today. It's growing. If you think about it, air travel demand averages about 5% a year, and that's just GDP around the world growing. So in places like China and India, as more people have more disposable dollars in their pocket to do things with, other than housing and food, they do a lot of things with those disposable dollars, right? They buy a new car, they buy a flat screen TV, they buy an airplane ticket to go visit grandma. And so if you think about in China, where they are adding 100 million people to the global aviation, getting on an airplane for the very first time every single year, it's a huge opportunity. And so the current market outlook basically says the world will need about just over 40,000 airplanes over the next 20 years, valued at just over $6 trillion. And even to a company like us that we did about 94 billion in revenue last year, 6 trillion is a lot of money. And it's concentrated really in a couple different ways. So there's two ways to analyze this, by unit and by value. And so this green bar are 737s, so single aisle airplanes. Small passenger wide bodies are 787 passenger airplanes. This mid-size are 777s, and then 47s at the end, right? And this is the reason why our buddies in France are having a problem selling A380s. And then little RJs. So if you go out here to the Missoula airport and you fly on a Horizon jet, Q400, a CRJ, eventually an Embraer 175, those are all little RJs. And of course, it's very well diverse across the globe. If you think about new airplane deliveries and then market value, obviously Asia is a huge portion, all right, of where both the number of airplanes are going as well as the value of those airplanes. But North America is also a big number. Europe's pretty big as well. But there are different types of airplanes that are going to go into that market. Primarily in Asia, those are new airplanes for growth. And then in America, or North America, and in Europe, those are replacement airplanes. So if you think about this, in 1993, 75-ish% of the people who got on an airplane that year were from Europe or North America. In 2035, only about 35% of the people who get on an airplane that year will be from North America or from Europe. So huge growths. And of course, this is sort of the trend line as it grows. So, and these are pretty much stay stable in terms of world traffic growth and world GDP growth. So they're inextricably linked to one another. And so that long-term trend line stays the same, although you'll have shocks inside of it. SARS, 9/11, economic recession in 2008. So all those things have a play on it. But if you look at the long-term trend line going back 50 years, it's pretty much stayed very stable. And of course, these emerging markets are really what's driving that marketplace. And so that's why we are the largest exporter, right, in the United States. So, and then here's kind of an example of how we break down those airplanes, both from a replacement and a new airplane perspective. And then obviously, as a component of that, is something that we are getting more and more into is the services side of the marketplace. So just last year, we pulled out of the defense side of the business and the commercial side of the business and formed a new business unit based just outside Dallas, where we are providing services to our customers for MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul type of work, converting passenger airplanes into freighters, Jefferson. So if anybody's a pilot here and you use aviation maps, Jefferson is a wholly owned subsidiary by the Boeing company, and so those are services, painting services, long-term maintenance of airplanes, spare parts, and the rotating part tools that are going on there, aviation. The great thing about having so many 737s in the world flying around, every 2.5 seconds, a 737 either lands or takes off. And so there are, a lot of our customers are in rotating pools for spare parts. And so if you've got a 737 that lands in Shanghai and you've got a broken part and you're a Delta, maybe you've got a partnership with Hainan down the ramp from you, and you can go borrow a 737 part for them, put it on your airplane, put that airplane back in service, your broken part gets put back in the pool, gets fixed, and get ready for the next time to get put on another airplane. So there's a lot of services that we think that are out there. This is a much more competitive marketplace in terms of number of entrants or number of people actually in that space compared to the OEMs, us and Airbus. So that's a lot of opportunity there for growth opportunity. Anyway, and just for advocation, here in Montana, we have a booth out there. Luke and Alyssa are manning it. So if you want to know more about sort of our investment in Montana from a Boeing company standpoint, you surely can go out there and learn about it. Two other things besides our Helena facility, where we do hard metal machining work. We employ about 150 people there, about 267,000 square feet of manufacturing space there. We also have a small support cell supporting the Minuteman program, because that's a Boeing-built program. We built all the silos and all of the missiles back in the 60s. And then we also own the airport in Glasgow. So the Montana Aviation Research Company is a subsidiary of ours, and we own the airport there, the old B-47 facility there out on the far northeast corner of the state. So with that, I'll take questions later with the rest of the panel members. Thank you.
Let's give our panelists another round of applause. A lot of great information. I know a lot of stuff coming fast and furious. So if you want to take a couple minutes and digest that, we're going to do some Q&A. 3 rules. Number 1, questions, not statements. 2, your name and company. And 3, this microphone does not leave my cold, dead hands. So.
Oh, yeah. This is for Rich. I'm Tom Speak. I speak in manufacturing in Lewistown. There's been a lot of talk about a very substantial project in the reconditioning or revitalization of the missile program out of Malmstrom. Is Boeing definitely into that project, or is that still up for winning the contract to do it? And if you know anything about timeline and the scope of that, particularly in local employment.
Yeah, so there is. So we in Northrop are the 2 down selects that the U.S. Air Force has selected to do what I would call technology refinement over a 3-year period. So that contract was awarded to us in Northrop last summer in August of 2017, and so we've got until probably August, September of 2020, and then the Air Force will then pick a final contractor to basically refurbish. It's called GBSD, or Ground-Based Strategic Deterrence, and so that will be the new iteration of the Minuteman program. So there probably will be a bunch of local jobs as we convert the existing bases, both Malmstrom, Minot, and the place in Wyoming. I can't remember the name at the top of my list. So there'll be a point in time where there'll be ramp up and obviously a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of still TBD work that is depending on how the technology phase goes and how it all then works itself out in that 2020, 2022 timeframe in terms of how then we plan for because we're going to be working on that for a long time if we get the down select for it. You know, we feel that we've got a really good shot at the contract, primarily because we are the heritage builder of the existing Minuteman program, and we've been supporting the U.S. Air Force and that mission for well over 50 years, since the first silos came online in 1964. So anyway, so that's kind of where we are on that. So we've had the GBSD guys there, they're all based out of Huntsville, Alabama, so that's where all our missile folks are. So whether it be the Atlas, we have anytime we put anybody has DirecTV, all those satellites for DirecTV, those are all Boeing-built satellites. We're the largest satellite producer in the world. And obviously we got a large space component as well, based either with the missiles being built in Huntsville or putting them in the space from the Cape or the Johnson Space Center in Houston. So anyway, so long answer to a short question, sorry.
Any other questions? Second. Got to do the Phil Donahue walk here, so.
Hello, I'm Kristen Heck with LC Staffing. Paul, thank you for sharing the statistics on employment in manufacturing in the state and how it's changed in the last 20 years. My question is, with regards to what happened in the 90s, how much outsourcing, both of labor and components, that I noticed even in Montana, with Montana manufacturers, the numbers that you share of manufacturers, were those pure manufacturers, or were components made in China brought back to Montana? Could that have affected the employment numbers?
The employment numbers I have are the ones that are collected by the Montana Department of Labor and Industry. For the most part, I think they are, well, I don't think there is the most part. It's such a wide variety of things that are included in that. If we look at the, maybe Patty can talk about what's going on down in Bozeman. I think some of that is component manufacturing, but I think some of that is also starting with raw materials and ending up with an electronic component. Do you have any?
I think they start out with mostly parts, an end product. I guess it's my impression that most of the photonics companies in Bozeman start out with parts, purchase parts, and end up with a final piece of equipment.
Now, remember how manufacturing has really changed since the 90s. In the 90s, that picture of plants, big plants with smokestacks, was right. We had Stauffer Chemicals. I mean, we had Smurfit Stone. We had the refinery at Columbia Falls. We had many large establishments. So some of the events during the 90s was the shift away from Columbia Falls aluminum plant, the shift away from the pulp mill and things along that line. So there was significant structural change in the industry during the 90s.
Any other questions? Oh, get you next first.
Ashley with Speaking Manufacturing. I had a question. The Washington percentage of manufacturing and industry was around 25%, whereas Oregon was 75%. Is there a non-favorable condition that exists in Washington that you guys are aware of that would make it more favorable for manufacturers to operate in Oregon versus Washington, given their locality?
So I have a little, well, I'm not an expert on this. I would say that the issue that's driving there is not necessarily business environment favorability or unfavorability. It really has to do with the fact that in Washington and Puget Sound, you have such a large number of other types of employers that aren't in manufacturing, you know, the Microsofts, the Amazons, Facebooks, Googles, that Oregon doesn't have. And so there are large numbers. So so what it is it's measuring a percentage of the overall workforce that are manufacturing, right? So I think the issue really is that Oregon, really from a large employer standpoint or manufacturing standpoint, you really got, you know, Nike and, which can, is just considered sometimes a manufacturing company because even though they don't make shoes here, and they've got Adidas, and you've got Columbia, sportswear kind of things. And so, but there's lots of small metal manufacturers. We, Boeing, have a facility just outside Portland. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the Puget Sound that isn't, I think, considered manufacturing. So I don't know if it gives a truly an accurate picture, right? Just because it's apples and oranges, in my opinion.
Paul, you want to follow up on that?
He's the expert on Washington and Oregon.
All right, sounds good.
Lauren Fraser, I'm a student at Helena College, but my question relates to manufacturing in Montana. How does our infrastructure and freight costs affect the ability to manufacture in a state like Montana? It's probably directed for Paul.
Go ahead.
Well, at one level, the answer is obvious. We are a sparsely populated area. We are probably the furthest away from the population center of the U.S. Of any state. So distance means cost. That's the underlying thing. But I think Patty might be able to amplify on that.
And I would say the successful companies in Montana seem to be manufacturers that are manufacturing something of high value in comparison to the freight cost. So if it was a very lightweight commodity, and the freight would be probably not economically feasible, but you got a company like Semitool, now Applied Materials, $1 million piece of machinery. The freight for that is kind of inconsequential.
Well, one other example is REC Silicon down in Butte. They export silane gas all over the world. And that's another one of those commodities that are very high value, but relatively small in terms of content.
Right, we got about 10 more minutes for questions. So,
Just a quick question to the panel. So being a Canadian,
actually, first, who are you?
yeah. So my name is Patrick Lammer. I'm with Lambs & Associates. I run an independent business consultant practice out of Edmonton, Alberta. I think I'm the only Canadian here today. Because Alberta, Montana, Western Canada, Montana trade a fair bit. The question is you talk about distance, logistics, transportation, manufacturing. We got all those problems in Western Canada because of time and space and lots of land and lots of miles in between. Has the state of Montana, or your experience, ever taken steps to really come to Alberta, come to Western Canada? There's a lot of Canadian companies right now that see the U.S. market as an incredible, viable place to go, whether it's via acquisition, via joint venture, via reinvesting and acquiring a Canadian company to open up the market to flow manufacturing into this state, because the state of Montana is a great segue to the rest of the U.S. Have you guys seen any moving forward, working with different various groups, whether it be privately held or governmentally driven in Western Canada or Alberta specific?
That was one of my gee whiz numbers when I was out in Billings or Great Falls. I say, what's the nearest big city? Half the audience would say Minneapolis, some would say Salt Lake, but it's actually Edmonton and Calgary. There was a lot of work done in the mid-90s with something called the North American Trade Corridor, which basically started in Edmonton and ended up, wherever you want to call it, San Diego or something along that line. There were some infrastructure projects that were attempted, or at least suggested, having more than one north-south freeway in the state, things along that line. But I have not seen anything except, anything really come to fruition out of that. It still is a very logical concept of that north-south corridor. So that would be, why hasn't it happened? I don't know.
Next question.
I don't know if I've got anything really to add. We have a Boeing fabrication facility in Winnipeg that produces parts for commercial airplanes. Obviously, we've got several customers, WestJet and Air Canada. I think Air Canada is getting some 787s right now. At least I saw some on the ramp in Everett a couple days last week. So to the extent that we can increase trade and opportunities between U.S. and Canadian firms, I think that's all to the positive.
The only thing I can add is, the only memory I have of any of this was in, about 15 years ago, General Dynamics of Canada was trying to partner with Cable Technology out of the Flathead, because General Dynamics of Canada couldn't sell into the U.S. military. So they were trying to partner, but that's the only attempt I've ever seen.
All right, we've got another question?
Really awkward. My question's for Patty. Hi, you know me, Kate Lufkin, Kalispell Chamber of Commerce. I appreciate the MMEC's efforts on strategic doing, right, and that a rising tide floats all boats. Can you give an example or a couple of examples of some of the projects that those communities are working on through strategic doing?
Sure, and if you don't mind, I'd like to ask Alistair to answer that. He is closer involved than I am.
Hi, everybody. Alistair Stewart with the Montana Manufacturing Extension Center. So there are a number of successful initiatives that have been going on over the last couple of years. Probably the most significant and long-term outcome has been through the work of the talent and workforce team at the Greater Gallatin Valley Manufacturing Partnership. Nikki Dixon Foley of Westport Design, of Westport, in conjunction with other colleagues at Westport and other leaders in the community, including Lamont Cotter of Blackhawk, seated up there, have developed a manufacturing curriculum that they have taken to the high schools and have started advocating to parents and children in high schools the value of a manufacturing career. And Lamont mentioned to me earlier today that a student at graduation, really, like the last couple of weeks, I think, came up to Lamont and said, well, now I'm looking for a job in manufacturing, right? And if you asked high schoolers 5 years ago, or parents of high schoolers 5 years ago at manufacturing, it's dirty, dangerous, dead end, and depressing, which is not true. Right? So I think that's one of the great successes that the collaborative efforts can claim. Another effort, which is spreading across the state beyond the Gallatin Valley, the first regional collaborative, which is starting to take hold in the Western or Missoula Regional Manufacturing Partnership and in the High Plains Business Alliance out of Billings, is the idea of a lean alliance. Patty put up the question there, what would it look like if Montana was a state of manufacturing excellence? So the Lean Alliance at Gallatin Valley meets on a monthly schedule every 30 days to do one of two things: go to a participating manufacturer's facility and fix a shop floor problem. Right? Accelerate flow, improve quality, drive out costs, reduce lead time. I mean, very practical stuff. We had a situation earlier on where somebody couldn't schedule at the constraining operation. 20 minutes in, a lean practitioner from another company said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to schedule the constraining operation, boom, 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 away we go. Problem solved on the day. So those are a couple examples, Kate, of what's going on. If you look at the micropolitan regional economies that we have, right, you got Billings, which is technically larger, but then you got Bozeman, Missoula, Kalispell, Flathead, and so on and so on. Manufacturers there, they can't get excellent on their own. Right? They need to collaborate. Somebody else has solved a problem that you're challenged with. And if you can go there with intentional collaboration to learn, if you can agree where competition begins and ends and where collaboration starts, everybody gets better. And if you look at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and their view on what's necessary to drive good prosperity gains in economies like we have here in Montana, that's where you'll see kind of the roots of this concept coming from. Thanks for letting me give you a couple of steps.
Oh, thank you, Patty. Question?
Art Warner, teach at the Helena College in the machine shop. You've done a great job expanding the facility in Helena. Do you see continued growth there or expansion?
Kevin's our site director, is in the back of the room, and so I don't necessarily want to speak for him. But I would say that at the current moment, I mean, we always have plans, right? And we're always thinking about what to do. Right now, there is growth, right, in the number of employees there. But our goal really is, our first and foremost goal, I would say, is really how do we drive efficiency and how do we, that productivity that Paul and Patty talked about. I mean, we as a company live that every single day, 365, right? So if you go back to the very foundings, right, of this company, Bill Boeing, reason why he got into aviation and building airplanes is because he broke his Martin airplane and they wouldn't fix it for him right away, and he felt there was a better way. So from a cultural standpoint, I believe that our company has always, from the very beginning, has always been about data-driven competition and getting better every day forever, because nobody around the world is standing still, and we can't do that. So to the extent that we lift up our own boat and we constantly evolve our Boeing production system, because that's the secret sauce, right, that we live every day, and also do the same for our suppliers. So our first and foremost goal at every Boeing facility across the world is how do we get more efficient, and how do we get every single day forever. When we have new work opportunities, obviously that will drive possible employment gains. But those two things, in my belief, have to be balanced. So, Kevin, do you want to add anything?
Well, I'll just talk a little bit about the Helena facility here in Montana. When we acquired the facility in 2010, we came here to acquire a set of machining capability. I think we quickly learned that we got a lot more than just a set of capability. We got a workforce that is extremely talented, and we have a culture that drives productivity and continuous improvement. And we recognize that, and we've since that time we've invested pretty heavily. We've more than doubled the size of our facility since 2010. I think when we acquired, we were about 110,000 square foot facility. We're now 257,000 square feet. We continue to grow and expand. I think this year we're adding close to 25 to 30 new positions in Helena, Montana. And we're continuing to bring more work and new work to the site here in Montana. And we have laid some groundwork for future growth and development. I'm not going to share too much, but we recognize that doing business here in Montana is good. It's good for the Boeing company, and we're going to continue to invest and grow here in the state of Montana. So the outlook is really good. So thank you. Good question.
And I'll just add too, I think, we do business in a lot of states around the country. And I think the most important thing to drive manufacturing growth in this state is really having policy set at the state level that is welcoming and partnering with manufacturers, right? Because we have a unique set of requirements, both from a technical standpoint and a workforce standpoint. So to the extent that we have this working together mantra where we're all pointed in the same direction, all pulling our oars in the same welcome, any business, for those of you who are in business, know that you being desired and wanted in that location is a huge incentive, right, for your culture, your business, your ability to innovate, your ability to grow and add jobs. And so to the extent that we all in Montana can continue to sort of create an environment where we're welcoming and partnering with folks, right, to have that preferred future, I think is super important.
Excellent. We have time for one more question. Going once. Twice. We start with a great one. We'll end with a great one with Mr. Spica.
Yeah, this is for Paul. He's in the middle of a question of his own over there. Hey, Paul, a quick question. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was talking
there.
about you.
Most of your data went through 2015, a little bit into 16. We all know that this past year has made some pretty remarkable impact on a lot of manufacturing sector. Not only a lot of uncertainty, but also a lot of incredible growth. Do you have any data that actually indicates what the past 2 years really have been in addition to what we are seeing on those trend lines, particularly for Montana's jobs?
Most of my data ended in 16, but we just did this survey for him, and we asked, what's the biggest problem you are facing right now skilled workers. And when we asked that same question last year, say half the sample said skilled workers. This year, when we asked that question, 75 or 80% said skilled workers. So it's labor, labor, labor. We are at full employment. Might be a recession, but we are at full employment right now.
A lot of great insight. Please give them a round of applause again. This was fantastic.